We open with a roundup of the region's major news stories. The impasse among rival groups in Cambodia continues and threatens to get even worse. Efforts by Thailand and Japan to persuade Khmer Rouge guerrillas to cooperate with the UN peacekeeping operation have failed. The two countries had been trying since August to negotiate a compromise with the rebel group. The foreign ministers of France and Indonesia will now take over the negotiations, but they doubt further talks will get the Khmer Rouge to rejoin the peace process. There's also little sign of compromise in ongoing talks between China and Hong Kong over the British colony's future. Chinese officials have canceled a conference intended to discuss details of China's takeover. The conference had been in the works for over a year, but Beijing says efforts by Hong Kong Governor Chris Patten to promote democratic reform forced the cancellation. One observer said the latest impasse between the two sides is so heated that there were fears the conference would only make matters worse.
In Japan, it looks as if the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's largest faction may split. Two groups are vying for control in the wake of former strongman Shin Kanemaru's resignation. One side has put up a candidate to lead the faction, but rivals say he's unacceptable. The split could slow up the legislative process, but would not have much short-term effect on policy, either domestic or foreign. Both groups agree on the direction of government. Their differences are almost solely a matter of who should lead the faction.
In Mongolia, 4 opposition groups have merged in an attempt to counter the influence of the ruling Communist Party. Calling itself the Mongolian National Democratic Party, the coalition came together after the Communists' surprise victory in the country's first election 2 years ago. In Singapore, a series of raids has resulted in the arrest of 140 people involved in sneaking illegal aliens into Europe and the U.S. Police report that 6 smuggling syndicates were crippled in the raids, which followed a 6-month investigation. They said the smugglers were offering illegals access to the country of their choice, complete with passport, for about $37,000. Officials in Vietnam say the so-called Hanoi Hilton, a notorious prison for captured American servicemen, will be torn down and made into a hotel and office complex. Early next year, a Vietnamese-Singaporean joint venture will start construction on 2 20-story tall buildings called the Hanoi Tower Center.
Thailand's new government has revoked legislation that had given sweeping powers to the country's military. The move comes after last spring's bloody crackdown on pro-democracy activists. Now the military must seek government approval before engaging in any action that would curb domestic political activity. Under the old laws, those decisions rested solely with the chief of the armed forces. And finally, 2 religious groups, one in the Philippines, the other in South Korea, are now begging forgiveness from their congregations. Both groups claim that Jesus Christ would arrive earlier this week to herald the end of the world. When he didn't show up, the congregation in the Philippines dispersed without incident. In South Korea, the government may take action against church leaders for deceiving their followers. And that's it for the news roundup. Now it's on to this week's features.
After almost a year of non-stop campaigning, the United States election is finally over, and Bill Clinton has been elected president. Now that the polls, the speculation, and the suspense are over, politicians in the states and governments abroad can get down to the real business at hand, defining the agenda of the new administration and how it will affect domestic and foreign policy.
Asian governments, like others around the world, watch the U.S. polls very closely. While defense and human rights were of some interest, protectionism and free trade were the issues that most concerned governments here. For them, as well as most American voters, economic issues predominated. We get the regional reaction from Asia Now's Vince Sherry.
While most governments in Asia publicly welcomed Bill Clinton's election, in private there was concern that a Democratic presidency could mean a change from the avowedly free trade policies of Presidents Bush and Reagan. In China, there was little official reaction. The news received perfunctory coverage on state-run TV, but a Clinton speech early in the campaign in which he referred to Beijing's leaders as tyrants, his criticism of President Bush's soft response to the Tiananmen crackdown, and his support for limitations on most favored nation trade status, or MFN, has proved cause for concern not only in Beijing, but throughout the region.
I think in Asia, he has to make certain decisions, and there will be certainly adjustments, some of them quite important and perhaps even major ones. That is, he has to According to his own remarks during the campaign, he was very critical of China on its human rights record, and he has to make certain decisions about U.S. relations with China.
Many are hoping that campaign rhetoric will give way to post-election pragmatism when Clinton takes office. Clinton, they say, has to balance his calls for human rights against the consequences sanctions would have not only for economic reform in China, but for U.S. and regional business. Zhengqing Wan is editor of a pro-China newspaper based in Hong Kong.
The major difference is that Washington may push a stricter policy on human rights. But if we look back at recent history, we see that even someone like President Carter, who made human rights a top priority, maintained good relations with China. Politicians say many things in the course of an election, but when they enter office, diplomacy and the economy take over. I think this will happen with Mr. Clinton.
Even Taiwan expressed hope that a Clinton presidency would not result in sanctions against China. Government officials also said they don't expect Clinton to reverse President Bush's election year decision to sell them F-16 jet fighters, a move which provokes strident criticism from Beijing. South Korea also had little official comment. They welcome Clinton's election but are concerned that he'll reduce the U.S. military presence. There are now 37,000 American troops stationed in South Korea. In Thailand, Prime Minister Chuan Lik Pai said the U.S. election would have little effect on his country. But businessmen there have echoed fears that free trade policies may be modified. They, like others in the region, are looking to the upcoming debate on China's MFN status as a litmus test for Clinton's Asia trade policy.
I think for the next few months, things will not change a great deal. The major test will come is the annual MFN debate, and that will occur sometime in April and May. And at that time, I think we'll begin to understand where President Clinton will come from.
In Japan, where it's fair to say the government would have preferred to see Bush re-elected, officials said they welcome Clinton's plan to revitalize the U.S. economy. Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa is already planning a get-acquainted trip to Washington. But here, where the Democratic Party has become almost synonymous with protectionism, business leaders are voicing the fears their government counterparts have been reluctant to express.
On trade issues, Mr. Clinton has some very tough views. So we here in the automobile industry are expecting a tougher time under the new Democratic administration.
Perhaps what's most worrisome for Asian leaders is that Bill Clinton is virtually an unknown quantity. For most, their only contact with the Arkansas governor has been what they've seen on TV. And what they've seen is a man who's made economic growth his top priority. They're only hoping that that commitment applies as much to Asia as it does to the U.S. Vin Sherry, Asia Now, Tokyo.